Okay, in this video we are going to look at the basics of HTML. And before we get into that, I want to kind of go over some of the inner workings of how the web works and what languages are used to display the things that you interact with in the browser on the websites and web apps that we deal with every single day. So before we get into that, first we're going to go to codepen.io, and I am currently logged into CodePen. So if you are logged into CodePen, you're going to be presented with this kind of showcase of picked pens, which is kind of cool because you can go in here and you can open up some of these and you can see the output of what people have done with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And then you can also kind of take inspiration from that and use that to make your own work. But for us, what we're going to do today is we're going to get used to HTML tags, how the syntax works, and what the output is on the screen. So if I am logged into CodePen and I'm looking at this view, I'm going to come over here to the left-hand menu to this menu that says Create, and I'm going to click on Pen. Now, you'll notice when you open this up, after you've clicked Pen, you have three panes. You have HTML, CSS, and JS, which stands for JavaScript. Now, the web and what you see in the browser is largely dictated by three separate programming languages. First is HTML, which is the content layer. Those are the words that you see, the images that you see, the forms you interact with, etc. CSS, which is something that we're going to come to a few lessons from now, is the styling layer. That is the language that tells the HTML how to look. It's what provides the background images, the color of the font itself, the spacing between elements, the overall layout of the page, and things like that. The JavaScript here, JS, is the interactive layer. It is what tells the elements on the page what to do. So JavaScript will, for example, say to a button element, if you are clicked, I want you to open up a modal window that says, would you like to sign up for our newsletter? JavaScript can do just about anything. It is a legitimate programming language, so you can do calculations, take the entries of form fields, submit them to the server, and really just build out an entirely immersive application similar to what you would find if you installed an app on your phone. We're not going to do a whole lot with JavaScript in Web 1. We will touch on it a little bit, but that's going to be a little bit later in the semester. For now, we're just going to look at HTML. We will come to CSS very soon, but I'm going to just slide these panels down so we can just focus on the HTML. And then this window on the right here is where we're going to see the output of the things that we write in our code windows. So when we're talking about HTML, it's really important to think about HTML as a way to imply human meaning of communication to a computer. So what I mean when I say that is that if you are writing a Word document in Microsoft Word, you will purposefully select heading specifications to put a heading for a section of your paper. You will purposefully use paragraphs when the time is appropriate to separate related pieces of content, etc. And HTML is very similar in that way. So what we're going to talk about today is standalone HTML elements. In a subsequent video, we will talk about container elements within HTML, which are elements that are meant to group individual elements together. But for today, we're going to look at the basics of content aggregation and information hierarchy within HTML. So before we do that, we need to see what an HTML tag actually looks like. So whenever we are going to write HTML, we start out with a left-facing angle bracket, and then we're going to add whatever tag it is that we're looking for. So let's start with a paragraph. We all are familiar with paragraphs from reading books and writing papers and things like that. Paragraphs work very similarly in HTML, the only difference being that they are surrounded by HTML paragraph tags instead of being indented. So I have my leftward facing angle bracket. I'm going to use the P tag, which stands for paragraph, and then I'm going to close that opening tag with a rightward facing angle bracket. Now I have my opening p tag or paragraph tag. So anything that comes after this is saying to the browser, this is a related piece of content. This is a paragraph, just as you are familiar with when writing Word documents. So now I can write anything that I want in here. I could say this is my first paragraph. And now that I have that text, you can see that text showing up over here in my preview, which CodePen is kind enough to provide us with. But if I want to make sure that this is a standalone paragraph and is sectioned off as such, I need to close the opening paragraph tag with a corresponding closing HTML paragraph tag. So to do that, we have a leftward facing angle bracket, and we're going to have a slash, and now we'll use the same text as the opening HTML tag to signify that we're closing this block of content. So since we open with a p tag here, I am going to close with a slash p and then a rightward facing angle bracket. And now I have an official paragraph set up over here, output on the web. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And sometimes when you save in CodePen, it'll reformat your editors for you. I'll just slide that back over so we can pay attention to what we're doing in our HTML panel. So now that I have this, I'm going to copy and paste it a few times. And you'll see over here on the right-hand side where the content is output, I have 4 paragraphs. Now granted, there's not a lot of content in there, but you could imagine like multiple sentences, etc., etc., and they would all be separated with these margins between each block of content and visually differentiated from one paragraph to the next. So that's great. So let's take the basics of that and let's apply it to headlines. So similar to what you see in Microsoft Word or any word processor, Google Documents, what have you, HTML provides us with several different levels of headings to group content together and to signify visually how the information hierarchy of the document that you're looking at is intended to be read. So let's start at the top with our level 1 heading. And in HTML, that tag is an H1 tag. And it's structured very similar to the P tag. So we're going to have a leftward facing angle bracket, and then the tag itself is H1, rightward facing angle bracket, completes the tag itself. So this is an opening tag here. Now, we're going to give the content to our H1 tag. So I'm just going to say this is my heading level 1. Now that I have that, I am going to add the closing tag to make sure that this heading level is separated from these 4 paragraphs that are contained beneath it. Because if you look over here in our output, since I don't have a closing tag for my H1, the browser is just kind of assuming that all of this is an H1, even though I have these 4 paragraphs. So let's close off the heading level 1, and then let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the output. So I'm going to do a leftward facing angle bracket, a slash, and then H1, rightward facing angle bracket. And now you can see that I have a very visually different heading and then my 4 paragraphs. So you might be asking why before I had this closing H1 tag was all my content there, but also a large font size and bolded. And the reason for that is HTML is what's called a fault-tolerant language. And what that basically means is that the browser is going to infer whatever it can and just try to make it work until it gets to the point where it knows what's going on. So basically, without this closing H1 tag, the browser was like, okay, there's an opening H1 tag and then there's all this content after it. So all that I can really assume is that this is all meant to be a heading level 1 element, which is really nice because it could, as an alternative, just throw an error and not display anything and crash your browser, but it just tries to like make the best of a bad situation by just kind of like rolling with the punches and displaying the content the best way that it knows how. But Now that we know better and we know that we need to close off our HTML tags, we're going to make sure that we have that heading level 1 tag closed. And now with that closed, we can see that the heading level 1 is by default given a larger font size and bold styling as compared to the paragraphs beneath it. So we have a number of different heading levels. We have an H2, and we'll say this is my heading level 2. And you'll see that show up. You might notice that the difference here is that the heading level 1 has the largest font size and the heading level 2 has a slightly smaller font size. They are both bolded, and as we go through the different heading levels, you'll see this trend continue. So we'll do heading level 3, heading level 4, we have heading level 5, and finally heading level 6. Whoops, let's start with the opening tag. Okay, now if we look at the output in the right hand, the preview more or less, we have biggest font for heading level 1, smaller font for heading level 2, and on the way down for 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you'll notice that the heading level 6 is even smaller text than the paragraph tag, but every single one of them is bold. The point here is that the browser is implying semantic meaning of the document based on the tags that we're using here. So if we're using an H1 tag, that is very clearly a top-level heading. An H2 tag can be used as a heading for different articles within the same newspaper front page, for example. And then heading level 3s can be sections within the articles as defined by the heading level 2s. And then paragraphs are what we're familiar with from reading books and writing papers. The point here is that by using the appropriate tags in our HTML, we are signifying visually both to the browser and to the consumer of the content what the meaning of the content within our tags is supposed to mean for the information that people are consuming. I say this because it's very important both for visual representation of information hierarchy, because there are times when your styling sheets will not load and you need to rely on appropriately formatted HTML to convey meaning to your users, but also because there are people that use the web that do not have access to eyesight and will rely on something like a screen reader to read the HTML document to them. And by using things like the appropriate heading tags and separating content into paragraphs with paragraph tags, users of assistive technologies like screen readers will be able to have that content read to them appropriately. So I'll keep coming back to this throughout the semester and throughout subsequent videos, but I really want to convey that using the appropriate tag, and this is an HTML tag, using the appropriate tag for your content is of utmost importance, both to sighted users and to people who use assistive technologies to consume the web. Okay, so those are our 6 heading levels and paragraphs, but we have more that we can work with. And before we get into that, I just want to comment on the next element that we're going to look at, and that is the A tag. The A tag is the link tag or an anchor tag. And what that does is it basically provides the superpowers of the web in your HTML documents. The most powerful thing that the web can do is to link from one page to another. And really that's the kind of thing that we take for granted because we're so used to it. We're so used to somebody sending us an email and there's a link in it and we click it and we go to the thing, and that's that's just day to day. But there was a time where in order to distribute content and in order to distribute software or artwork or music or whatever, You needed a lot more than a simple A tag to get that out to as many people as the web touches. With the introduction of the World Wide Web and the anchor tags that go along with it, it meant that now you, as designers, can have a gallery on your website, and people can immediately link to your works and see the things that you do. It didn't mean that you had to get them into a gallery to see your prints hanging up on a wall. And if you are a musician now, with the introduction of anchor tags within the web, you can record a song, put it on your personal website, have an anchor tag linked to it, and anybody can get to it who has access to the web. So that's a really, really, really powerful thing that's really hard to overstate the importance of, especially because it's become so ubiquitous in our day-to-day life. So let's just look at how that works. And we're going to look at it with a fairly underwhelming example, but you'll at least see the mechanics of how that works. So we're going to construct our link or our anchor tag, and we're going to do that very similarly to what we've done with our headings and our paragraphs. So we're going to have a leftward facing angle bracket, and then we're going to type the letter A. A stands for anchor, and that's just our tag. Now, the anchor tag is a little bit different in that it needs at least one piece of extra information in order to work. And the extra information that we're going to give it is what's called an HTML attribute. And attributes are really just extra information supplied to the HTML tag to get them to either function in a way that you want them to function, or to convey some extra meaning to that tag that is not implicit within the content that the tag wraps. So for an anchor tag or link, we need to use what's called the href attribute. So we type out the A, which is the tag itself, and then we have a space to set up our attribute. And now we need to give a value to the attribute. So we do that by giving an equal sign. And in the case of the href attribute, what we're providing to that is where we want this link to go. Where do we want this this anchor tag to direct us to within the internet? And this could be a page within the same site. This could be an additional page out on the web somewhere. This could be a link to an audio file that you've recorded. This could be something that you would download, like a piece of software that you've written. There's a lot of things that you can do with the href attribute. But the important thing for our purposes in Web 1 is to think of this as the location that we want this link to take us to. So for the sake of demonstration, let's have this link take us to Google. So I've got my href attribute, and then I have an equal sign, and then the equal sign is going to contain, in quotation marks, the URL or the website that I want this to go to. So I'm just going to take this to Google. So we'll write https://google.com. Then we're going to finish off our opening tag with that rightward facing angle bracket. And then we're going to give some text here. And the text is going to be the thing that you click on to go to a different point in the internet. So here we'll say link to Google. And now that we have that, we need to close this off, just like we did with our paragraphs and our headings. So we'll have leftward facing angle bracket /A, because that is what matches the opening tag, and then a rightward facing angle bracket to complete that closing tag. So now if you look over here, I've got a blue highlighted text with an underline, and you'll notice when I hover over it, my cursor changes from an arrow to a pointer finger. And that's great, because that signals to me, based on convention, and I'm sure that you've experienced this as users of the web, that this is something that I can interact with. And the underline and the blue says to me that this is something that's going to take me to a different page. So let's do that. Before I do, let me just say real quick, in CodePen, this will behave slightly differently than it will if you are on a normal website or when you make your normal website. So what I'm going to do now, just to demonstrate that this works, is not something that you will have to do in a normal website, but because of the way that CodePen is built, if I were to do this and just click this link, it would open up like a nested window in here. But this is just for demonstration. So the part about writing your A tag like this remains the same in CodePen. I'm going to do something just a little different. So I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to say open link in new tab. And now you see this new tab pop open, and there it is. I've got Google open. So that's pretty powerful. Um, and again, I don't want to understate how important that is to just the overall functionality and power of the web. Okay, so that's great. That's an interactive piece of content that will take me from either one page to another, from one point in my page to a different point in the page, or from one point in my page to an entirely different point in the internet. But what if I want to trigger some sort of action within the same page? What if I want to pop open, say, a modal, for example, or if I want to open up a slide down menu or something like that? In that case, from a semantic standpoint, an anchor tag or a link is not appropriate. And for that, we have something called the button tag. So again, we're going to kind of construct our opening tag the same way that we've done with everything else. We've got a leftward facing angle bracket, the name of the tag, and then a rightward facing angle bracket. And then we're going to put the text in here that we want to have contained within the button. So I'm going to say this is my button. And then again, we're going to do the same construction of the closing HTML tag. So leftward facing angle bracket slash same text as we have in our opening tag, and then rightward facing angle bracket. So you'll notice now here in my output HTML on my preview panel, I've got this, very obviously button. It's got an outline around it. It's got text in the middle. It's got a little bit of a gradient background. I'm not sure if that comes through in the recording. And then you can click on it. You can click it and you can see that when I click it, there is a state that is happening. It's turning blue, and just to respond to the click event that I am applying when I touch down with my mouse. And that's great. Granted, it's not doing anything at the moment, but the reason for that is I haven't told it to do anything. A lot of times with buttons, unless they're inside of a form, you have to explicitly tell them with JavaScript what you want them to do. But just by having used the button tag, I get this styling, which is very visibly a button, and I get the ability to use my tab key to send focus to it. I get the ability to hit the enter key to fire it. I get the ability to use my spacebar to fire it. So there's a lot of functionality that comes with the button element without having to employ JavaScript. So that's pretty cool. All right, next up, let's look at images. So images are kind of interesting. Images are what's called a self-closing HTML tag. So everything that we've looked at so far, we've had our opening HTML tag and then a corresponding closing HTML tag with a slash. They look very similar. The closing just has the slash to denote that we are closing off this block of content. Images are a little bit different. So let's look at that. So I'm going to start out just like I have with all my other HTML tags. I'm going to do a leftward facing angle bracket, and then I'm going to type img. And img is short for image. Now img is similar to the a tag in the sense that it needs a couple of attributes or additional pieces of information for the HTML tag in order to function. So the first attribute that we need for the image tag to function is the src attribute, which stands for source. And what the source attribute is going to do is it's going to say to the web browser, hey, here's where the image lives that I want you to display on the screen. Please go find it. And you have the option to either supply an image source that you have contained within your overall document. So imagine it being in a folder structure with your HTML and your CSS and everything else. You can have that be the value of the source attribute, or you can go out to any image on the web and use that as your source attribute, which is what we're going to do here. So we've got src, and then just like with the href, we need an equal sign, and this is where we're going to say, here's the image that I want you to find. So we're going to do an opening and closing quotes, and in CodePen, there is a little tab at the bottom here that says assets. And if you open that up, you're going to be presented with a number of options. Now, I have a pro membership with CodePen, which means that I pay a little extra for some special features. So you won't see this thing here unless you also have a pro account that says your files. But you should see these free design assets. So if you click on photos, you're going to be basically presented with all of Unsplash. There will be some default things that just show up, but you can also search for whatever you want, like bike, um, mountains, surf. It's Unsplash, so there's a ton of options here. So I like bikes, so I'm going to do bike. And then this thing here is kind of cool. Um, this old school slide out photo. So in the CodePen Assets panel, if you click on a photo, you'll notice that it will copy the photo URL to your clipboard. So that means it's basically the same thing as doing Command-C or Control-C on Windows. So now that I have that on my clipboard, I'm going to come over here in my source attribute between the quotes, and I'm going to paste that. Now, there's a bit of a bug going on with CodePen at the moment where it is not actually copying the URL. So let's just get something from Google. So in Google, I'll type bike, and then I'll select images. Sure, the Strider looks cool. So I have this image open now. I'm going to right click on it and I'll say copy image location. And that is copying the place on the web where this image lives. So I'll come back to CodePen, and within my src attribute between the quotes, I'm going to Command V or Control V if you're on Windows, and that is going to paste the image location on the web into that source. And you can already see that it's shown up here. I haven't closed this tag yet. I haven't done anything other than provide the source, but that goes back to the source tolerant nature of HTML that is just trying to like make it work for me. I've got the opening image tag without the closing bracket. I've got the source attribute in there, so it's just trying to make it work. Okay, so we have an image on the screen, but we need a second attribute for the image tag, and that attribute is the alt attribute. Now the alt attribute is critical for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you are doing an image that is critical to the content that you're working with, imagine a news article where there is a photo in there that provides context and meaning to the text contained within the article. In that case, if somebody using assistive technology comes to your site and they come across this image, and that image is important to the overall context of the content, you want the image to be read by the screen reader that they're using in a way that makes it so the assistive technology user gets the same context as a sighted user would, kind of skimming through here. So in this case, if this was really important to the rest of my content, like if I was writing an article about Strider bicycles, I might give the value in here of like 2020 Strider Cruiser or whatever. And then if somebody using a screen reader was going through this article, imagine this is an article on Strider bikes, and they came to this image, the screen reader would read to them 2020 Strider Cruiser. Now, alternatively, you might have an image in here that is just total fluff. Like it might not have anything to do with the content. In our imaginary situation where this is an article about Strider bikes, we might have like something in here where we have an image of like a field or whatever, just because it's pretty. In that case, you can just omit the value of the alt tag and just have empty quotes. And you may be thinking to yourself, like, why even do that? The reason is that if a screen reader comes to an image tag and there is no alt attribute present, even if it has empty quotation marks, the screen reader will read the source attribute to the user. So in this case, if I didn't have an alt attribute, I decided that this image was like purely fluff and did not matter to my content. It was just pretty. The screen reader would read https://images-na .ssl-images-amazon.com, etc. And that's a terrible experience for someone. So always have an alt tag with your image tags. If it is decorative, just have empty quotes. If it is important to the content that you're using, then please provide some meaningful context within those tags. Okay, so that is the tag itself and the two most important attributes that go along with it. Now, I don't have to wrap this image tag around anything. I can just close it off by doing a rightward facing angle bracket, and I'm done. Cool. Okay, so let's look at two more elements in this example. Let's talk about lists. So we've all seen lists. We've all read. Well, maybe we haven't read, but we've all been familiar with recipes, for example. And if you're looking at a recipe, and this will come up later in the semester, you'll notice two specific kinds of lists within the recipe. First, there will be a recipe which lists out the ingredients that you need. I'm sorry, a list that lists out the ingredients that you need, and then there will be a list that lists the steps required to make the dish. So, in the case of the ingredients, it doesn't really matter what order they present those to you in, as long as you have them all. So, thyme could come before flour, flour could come before thyme, etc. But in the case of the steps to prepare the dish, that is very important if you decide to, I don't know, baste something before you mix something. There could be totally different results. The point is, there's different context for those lists, and HTML has separate elements to deal with the way that different lists are meant to be implied to somebody reading the content. So let's talk about the list where the order doesn't matter. That is what's called an unordered list in HTML. And the tag for that is a UL tag. Now, the UL tag doesn't do anything by itself. The UL tag needs what's called child elements in order to be appropriate in terms of the content that is conveying to you. This is kind of like the first foray into the concept of parent elements and child elements, and we're going to go into much more detail in this in a subsequent lecture. But for now, just know that we have an opening UL tag, and then within that tag, we're going to have a collection of other HTML tags. And as long as we're inside of a list, which UL stands for unordered list, we're going to need list items, or LI tags. So we're going to set this up similar to our other tags. We're going to do a leftward facing angle bracket, LI, rightward facing angle bracket, and then whatever content we want in here. So we'll just say this is an item, and then we're going to close this. This is not a self-closing tag, so we'll do angle bracket slash LI angle bracket, and then let's put another item in here, angle bracket LI angle bracket. This is another item. Close that off. And now I've got these two list items, but I want to close the entire list. So we're going to put a closing UL tag in here, and this UL is going to wrap around these two list items, and the UL is an HTML element itself, and then each LI is an HTML element that lives within that UL. Now let's look at the output of that. If we come down to the bottom of the screen, you see we have a bulleted list where we have our content. This is an item with an extra and then we have this is another item. Great. So we've got this bulleted list where we know these things are related because the bullets visually imply that they live together. And if I'm using a screen reader or assistive technology, it will come to this UL tag and it will say unordered list, two items, and it will read these two items to the user, and that user will know that these are items in a collection, which is super useful. Now, I also mentioned sometimes there's a list where you need to know what order things need to go in. And it's very similar to the unordered list, but in this case, the HTML tag is OL, or ordered list. So we're going to set it up very similarly. We're going to have angle bracket OL, and then again, the OL tag does not do anything on its own. It needs these direct child elements, or elements that are contained one level down within that opening tag, in order to do anything. So much like the UL, we're going to use the LI tags here as well as the child. So we'll say LI, we'll say item number 1, close that off. LI, item number 2. Yeah. And now let's close off this OL. So the structure looks just the same as the UL, but let's look at the output. Instead of our bullets, we have 1, 2. And this would continue on if I were to make multiple list items. You'll see now that I've added all those other ones in there, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it will keep doing that as long as I go. Like I could go down to 100 items and the browser will by default output that. So that is the basic introduction to HTML. You can kind of see how HTML tags are structured. Here we are essentially looking at standalone HTML elements, headings, paragraphs, links to separate content, buttons to trigger in-page actions, images to display images on the screen, and while the list items, or the lists that we're looking at here, the unordered lists and the ordered lists, are technically container elements, it's worth bringing up here because you can see how they are able to group content together for semantic meaning. So before we wrap up, let's just talk about the styling that we see here. So I mentioned before, H1 has this big font and bold, H2 has smaller font and bold, and on down the line to H6, which is still bold, but the font's not as big. The paragraphs are separated visually with some margin and a line break. The A tag is colored with an underline. The reason that this is purple versus it being blue in the first place is because I clicked on it to take us over to Google. And then you can see the button styling of this button with the outline. And then, as we just discussed, we have the bulleted list for the unordered list, and we have the numerical list for the ordered list. So all of these things are what's called browser default styles. The browser infers meaning from the HTML tags that you use, and then based on the HTML tags that you use, applies a default styling to each element that you provide. Now, you might think, well, great, I don't like serif fonts for my headings, and I think that the text is too small for this button, and that may be true, but that is where CSS comes into the picture. You have the ability to affect the styling of every HTML element on the page with CSS. And while you may not like the initial output that the browser gives you, the fact that it exists at all is extremely useful for the situations where you may be delivering your content to somebody who has a very bad network connection and your CSS, the styling layer, does not load. Or perhaps the server that you have your CSS hosted on falls over one day. As long as you have your HTML structured in a way that is semantic and makes sense and implies visual meaning without an extra layer of styling on top of it, your users will get your content and they will be able to understand what you're trying to say to them. So I want to stress very, very, very much that using the appropriate HTML tag for the appropriate situation is incredibly important, and you will have control over the styling of the visual output when we learn about CSS. But for the time being, just look at this and understand that the default styling that the browser gives you, depending on your HTML elements, is very, very useful. All right, that's it for basic HTML. We are going to look at container HTML elements and the concept of child and ancestor relationships in our next video. See you then.